everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Storytime. Last time we took a look at the Storytime web application and created stories for our buddy Pete and Ben in the dialogue editor. Today we are going to move on to the Unity and import the Unity package and use it for our stories. But before we continue with the content, while you are already watching this video, make sure to hit that like button. If you really want to keep up to date with the changes of Storytime, smash that subscribe button. So with that out of the way, let's do a little bit of background check. Like many role-playing games, dialogues are an important way to tell your story to the player and immerse them into the game and feel attached to one or more characters. How intriguing is it to chit-chat with your local passenger or progress in the story and see how your choices impact the game? That's what we're going to do in Storytime. In Storytime, we use stories to define a storyline for one or multiple characters. Each story basically also represents a quest, and with quests you can attach tasks to them. With those tasks you can define optional dialogue to define the current state of the story. But that's for a later video. Without further ado, let's jump into Unity and start creating our stories. So, as you can see, I have a simple scene with Jammo character from the Mix and Jam series. This asset can be found in the asset store. What we want to do is go to the package manager and make sure we have the following from the samplers list. First, we have to make sure that Storytime package is installed in the package manager. You can, as you can see, I already have installed mine. But if you haven't, you can click on the plus icon, add git URL, and then paste the GitHub repository from Storytime. Link in the description if you want to find where it is. Once you install the Storytime package, you want to make sure that the following folders are installed. That's the essentials, the input controls, and lastly the persistent manager for our UI. When that's all installed, next we're gonna create a new folder called settings. I already created mine because I have a URP project. This could also be the case for you if you have your Universal Render Pipeline project set up. Once in the folder, right click, create, database sync, and configuration and dialog settings. You can press enter if you just want to keep the name. I will keep the name in my case and press enter. The dialog setting configuration is basically global settings for defining your font, your audio clip, your voice clip, which will be changed in the future because voice clip is more character based. You can define your character font size, dialogue font size, if you should have auto resizing. So if you have a dialogue and there's too many text, you want to make sure that you click enable the auto resize because that will help you fit the text more into the dialog box. You can also show the dialogue at once, so that means when you are talking to someone, it will show the dialogue in one sentence immediately instead of going character by character. So back in the settings folder, you want to right click again, press create, database sync, configuration and config file. You can press enter if you want to keep the name or change it if you want. I'm going to press open, which open the database settings. This settings is basically the settings that you define to make a connection with your server. So I will drag and drop this, and let me drag it over here so it's more in a better overview. As you can see, this is the database URL, which is basically your server where it needs to connect to, your project ID that you want to use, so the project that you where you want to grab the data from. Email is basically the same as the email that you log on into the Storytime web application. Password is also the same as your Storytime web application. And the data pad is basically the pad where you want to store all the data. So if I'm going to press choose data pad, this will open the dialog window. And if you don't have a folder called data, I suggest you make one for yourself. You can also store it wherever you want, but I'm going to store it in a data folder because that is basically all the JSON data. And I'm going to select the folder. As you can see, this is the data pad. It filled out the string for me. This is basically the place where it's going to store all this data, and now it knows via the database settings where to store it. So I filled in all the credentials, and as you can see, I use my own hosting provider for connecting to the StoryTime web application. And last time I used it as well, and I created a project that I showed you guys. This is the ID from that project. This is the email as well that I use, and the password, and then the pod that we're gonna connect the data to. So in the top header, you can see a drop-down menu which is created by the StoryTime package. You can sync all the tables, which we have to do in our case for the first time. But later on, if you have synced all the data, it will show you a list of the tables that you can sync individually. Once you click on the sync button, it will start syncing all the data from the StoryTime web application and store it on your local machine. And now that it's done, you can see that it says fetching complete. Now if you go to the data folder, and you can see that all the JSON files are located locally. You can right click it, show in Explorer. So now that is out of the way, we can start working on our camera and input controller to walk simply around in the scene. First, we want to import the gameplay scene in order to manipulate the UI without leaving the main scene. In the project window, go to the search field and type in gameplay. You can see a bunch of files that are listed here. We want to grab in the gameplay and drag on top of the hierarchy. Now you see that the gameplay scene is loaded with all the UI manager, dialog manager, story, inventory manager. These are all the files that are missing right now. Those are basically from the placeholder sample file. You can also download. You can also go to the package manager and download that one as well if you want to, but we are going to create our own. So now that we got the gameplay scene inside the dialog scene, we head over to the samples folder, StoryTime, the preview folder, input, and this is where all the files are located, which defines the input for the player. It also defines the input that you can have with multiple NPCs, so in order to interact with them. If we click on Jamo, it has a movement input script attached to it, but it misses the input reader in order to move around. Drag and drop the input reader on top of the field from the input reader in order to receive events to move around in the scene. But now it still can move because it isn't working according with the new input system from Unity. So in order to make that happen, you have to search for the player input with the icon, and that basically is the new input system from Unity. Press enter. Now the first field defines the action that it needs to send messages to the other mono behaviors in order to move around or interact with the world. Let's drag and drop the gameput input action on top of the first field. The default scheme, we're going to choose keyboard or gamepad. You can define multiple schemes for yourself, but for now I just created a basic one where you can move around, interact with NPCs, etc. It also turn off auto switching because if you are in the dialogue and you are talking to an NPC, you don't want to still walk around. Although you can still have that behavior if you want to, but for now I will just keep it as it is. Select gameplay for our default map scheme. Now, as you can see in the dialogue scene, there's a main camera in the world. We can click and delete it and use our own. Search again in the project window in the search field, camera rig. Drag and drop the camera rig inside the dialogue scene. This is basically a camera rig that are already created in the Essentials samples package from StoryTime. You can basically create your own cinema machine. I like cinema machine and I use it for all my projects. And for this particular case, I already have a game camera and a dialogue camera attached to it in order to get a different camera for the dialogue and a different camera for the gameplay. So now if you go to the game camera, it says follow and look at. We want to make sure that Jammo is attached to the follow and the look at. So now if you press save, and I think I'm ready to go. Press play and it should follow our Jammo character now. So you can see Jammo can now walk around easily inside the environment. Great. In the gameplay scene, I have a bunch of prefabs already made in the StoryTime package. You have here the UI manager, dialogue manager, story manager, and the inventory manager. The UI manager connects all the managers together and shows you basically the dialogue if you need it, or shows you the story manager, which is basically a quest log if you want to compare it. And the inventory manager, that shows basically the inventory of the player. In the bottom list of the UI manager, you can see that the dialogue controller and the rest aren't filled in yet. Those are the managers that we are going to create together. But first we need to connect the input reader again, just like the revision controller. This way the UI manager can handle the input from for example, if the player has to press enter or spacebar to continue to the next dialogue, this input reader will know when that button is pressed. Now that we have connected the input reader, now in the hierarchy, create a new panel in the canvas. I already created those prefab for me for the sake of this video, but it doesn't have all the motion behaviors attached to them because we're going to do that in this video. So let me grab the prefabs and connect it to the canvas. The dialog panel will basically display, if I double click, it's a simple UI that I created for the dialog manager. So here, if I expand it, you have a dialog line which basically shows the text of the person that is talking. The character background is just the character that is currently talking to the player. Then these are the panel with choices that the player can choose from, and it will toggle on and off in the dialog manager that you will see in a few seconds. In the in-game screen, I have a interaction panel, and the interaction panel is, if I enable it, is basically a way to let the player know that we are close to an NPC or an object that we can pick up, and then shows in the UI what the interaction is. So for example, if you are close to an NPC, it will toggle this interaction panel on and off and show like, okay, we are close by, do you want to interact with? Then it will show that. The interaction panel will also know if we are close to an item, and then it will show the interaction with an item. You can also create different interactions for yourself, but that for a later video. In the dialog panel, click Add Component and search for the UI Dialog Manager. So here you see the sentence, which is a localized string event. This localized string event comes from the Unity localization package. This localization package is in charge of localization. So if you have multiple languages that you define in StoryTime, this localization string will handle that for you. Now let's search for the sentence that is going to be attached to this manager. So drag and drop the dialog line on top of the localization string event. If you want to know how this is connected, you go to dialog line and add a TMP vertex animator. The TMP vertex animator is a component also created in StoryTime. This is in charge of showing individual characters for you or shows the text immediately. The localized string event is a script that you can attach to the TMP vertex animator. This is a component that is necessary to toggle between different languages. This is empty in your case, so make sure you add a new event and drag and drop the TMP vertex animator script to it. Now in the functions, go to the vertex animator and click on text. So now you have connected the localized string event and the vertex animator together. So if there's a change in the language, if the player does that in the player settings, for example, then it will know how to toggle between those texts. Now if we go back to the dialogue manager, you can see the actor name is not attached to that one as well. So let's do that now, like this. And like I said, it's basically the same thing as the other sentence. You attach the TMP vertex animator, or in my case a normal Text Mesh Pro, and connect the Text Mesh Pro again and set the text so that it can toggle between different strings. Now let's define and connect the choices manager to the UI dialog manager. So drag and drop the panel on top of this one. So for your own computer, make sure you have a panel or something similar where you can set up the dialog manager, and then a panel where you can define your choices, and then from there the child with a UI choice filler, and with a child with a button attached to it and a text. So drag and drop text on it, and if I click on the text, it's the same what I just displayed for the dialog line, where you have a localized string and a Text Mesh Pro component attached to it, and then combine them together in order to get the switching of the localization. And for the other three, I do basically the same thing. Now that that is finished, you need to make a way sending an event that says, okay, I clicked on this button. In order to do that, you need a dialog choice channel, which you can find in the StoryTime package. So for choice here in the list, you have a event called onChoiceSelectedUI event, and I'm gonna drag and drop this one on top of the button choice number 3. Same goes for button choice number 2, and same for the last one, button choice number 1. Now that we have filled in all the 3 button choices, drag and drop the choices on top of the list of buttons that we have. Like so. Press save. Now that we have set up everything correctly, now we need to know when we have to hide or show the choices. This is also handled by an event. As you can see, we still have the list available. This is for the hide choices event. Drag and drop it on top of that one, and this is the show choices event. And press save. This sets the requirements what you need for a simple dialog manager. Now move on to the interaction panel. Make sure you have a panel which is thus a panel UI component with a horizontal group or anything that you like that basically tells the player in the UI where it can see what we are interacting with. Then add a component called UI Interaction Manager. Again, that works in the same way as the dialogues panel and all the other managers that I just described. But this one is a little bit different, where I define a list of interaction. And the item is basically the middle hierarchy, where we are going to display what kind of interaction we have. And the list of interaction are scriptable objects, where you can define what kind of interaction it is. And let me show you. So I have increased the number in the list by 3, and it needs a interaction scriptable object, and that basically means that first one is the cooking interaction, crafting interaction, it doesn't matter in which order you present them, and the NPC interaction. These are just pre-made scriptable objects to let the manager know with what kinds of objects we can interact with. That concludes this part of the video. To summarize, we have taken a look at how to set up the database config files and made a connection to StoryTime. Now remember, these files are important, or else nothing will work in the end and you are not able to fetch your data. We also took a look at the dialog manager and how we made a UI that we are going to use for the second part of our video. Next up, we're also going to take a look at the localization and grab the dialog data for our UI. We're also going to place our NPCs Pete and Ben into the game and add ability to talk to them. So stay tuned for that. Let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions, feedback or tips. If not, then I will see you all in the next chapter of StoryTime.